All right, welcome back. It's been a couple weeks since you have seen me or I have seen you. We are in session 6, but we did have last week off. So since we have had last week off and you have slept since we last talked, and it's already at this point been 5, 6, 7 weeks into the series, I thought it'd be good just to start off by just summarizing the first 5 lectures. The first 5 sessions, just what have we talked about, where have we been, and then we'll dive into where we're going. So session 1, 7 weeks ago, session 1, we talked about 3 key principles. 3 key principles. The principle of humility, which says, I don't have it all figured out. You're allowed to disagree with me. It's okay. Matter of fact, all of us should be, on some level, aware of who we are and what it is that we both have accomplished and what it is that we still have yet to accomplish, how finite we are. And yet in God's grace, we can still accomplish something. The principle of humility. We also had the principle of submission, which says, I am committed to the Word and the Spirit transforming me, and not the opposite. Not me transforming the Word into what I want it to say or what I want it to be. Which leads to the third principle, the principle of context. I promised in the first lecture that over these 9 weeks, I would say context about 100 times. And by my count, I'm about 90. So context, context, context. Now I'm even closer. Context. You can take the Bible out of context, but if you do, you can make it say whatever you want. And you can make a lot of money doing that. But that cannot be the goal. Matter of fact, the first 2 principles guide us to the third one. That we keep things in context because we are more interested in hearing what God has to say to us than for us to have our agendas furthered by us taking it out of context. That was session 1. Session 2, we went and we diffused some semantic bombs. We dealt with things like literal versus figurative, where we said we don't do it literally or figuratively, we read the text naturally. We dealt with last days. We saw that it was not a time period of 24-hour periods right before the second coming of Jesus. No, last days is the time period between the first coming and the second coming of Christ as defined by the New Testament texts. We also looked at prophecy, and we saw that prophecy does not equal prediction. That prophecy is engaged in prediction, but only around 17% of the time. But prophecy instead is doing something much bigger. It is a revelation of who God is, and what God desires, and what God demands of His people. Specifically a people that are in rebellion, a people that are in conflict, a people that need to be called to action. Then in session 3, we dealt with the historical background. Hopefully at this point you're both taking a breath and remembering. It's all coming flooding back to you. I trust that is true. We looked at the historical background. Then we summarized historical background with one word, and that was conflict. That's exactly right. Conflict. Christians were in conflict with the Jews of the Roman Empire. Christians were in conflict with the Roman society as a whole. And their conflict manifested itself at times with physical and non-physical persecution. But all of the book of Revelation cannot be read without the context of conflict. If you don't have that in place, you'll make it say some ridiculous things. Session 4, we looked at genre. We looked at the type or the kind of the book of Revelation so that we can make sure our questions that we were asking are actually the questions that the text wants us to ask. And we saw that the book of Revelation is a prophetic, apocalyptic epistle, a letter. It is a letter written to 7 churches of the book of Revelation in Asia Minor using heavy symbolism, because the genre of apocalypse, it demands that symbolism. But the point is to reveal, as the genre of prophecy asks us to reveal who God is, what God desires, and what God demands of His people. Then, session 5, 2 weeks ago, we talked about symbols or symbolism. And we saw that symbols have power. And the book of Revelation is saturated in symbolism. And then we asked the question, if it is saturated in symbolism, how do we interpret all the symbols? And I gave you 3 rules. All of them were the word context, just with different letters capitalized. The first level of lowercase c context is you need to read the 4 or 5 verses right before or right after the symbol. The capital C context is if you then still don't know what the symbol means, you need to read how the image is used throughout the entire book of Revelation. If you are still struggling with how the symbol is to be interpreted, then you look at all capital letters context. How is the symbol being used in the Old Testament? And through these levels of investigation, you should be able to have a good handle on what it is that you're looking at in Revelation. That last one's especially important. We talked about how in 404 verses of the book of Revelation, by my count, there are over 516 allusions to the Old Testament. If you don't know the Old Testament, you're going to see Apache helicopters in the book of Revelation. That's the bottom line. That's the first 5 sessions. Today, I want us to talk about the structure of the book of Revelation. And I'm going to be honest with you up front. This may be one of the most difficult concepts to grasp when it comes to the book of Revelation. I mean, I always joke with my students in my Revelation class here at Ozark. I always say, if I was really a mean teacher and I wanted to punish you, and if you cross me, maybe I will, I'll make you outline the book of Revelation. Because it's almost impossible. It is an incredibly difficult book to outline because it is an unfamiliar organization of thoughts. It is an unfamiliar way of organizing thoughts or a progression of thinking. It is not something that we are savvy. It's not something that we normally engage in the way in which Revelation is engaging it. As a matter of fact, at times you will see this in Hollywood films. I don't know if you've ever seen the film Memento. I remember the first time I started watching it, I was kind of freaking out because if you haven't seen the movie, it actually starts at the end. And it goes 5 minutes, and then it rewinds, and goes 5 minutes before that, and then goes, and then rewind, and you watch the movie in reverse. I actually didn't like it, because it just was an unfamiliar way of organizing thoughts. Or think of the movie Crash. I don't know if you've seen it. It actually starts at the end. And then it goes up to everyone, through different characters, it replays all the events from their eyes, but it keeps going back over the same events, even Lost. The show that is no longer on television, but you can see it on Netflix. It is an unfamiliar organization of thoughts. The book of Revelation is the same way. And it is difficult for us to outline the book of Revelation, and frankly, even to understand Revelation, because it is not organized in the way in which we think. As a matter of fact, there is a tension between progression and I'm going to use a big word, recapitulation. We'll define that second word here in a bit. Our way of thinking in the Western world, American minds, we think progressively. We think in progression. We think linearly. A leads to B, which leads to C, which leads to D, and then we reach our conclusion. This is how we normally engage in speeches, in sermons, in books. We move from A to B to C to D, and then we hit our point. Linear thinking. The problem is the book of Revelation was not written by a Western mind. The problem is John was a Jew writing in the first century. And Jews don't think linearly, they think cyclically. Now I know. I'm challenging you to step up to the plate. This is going to be hard to follow, but you can do it, and the payoff is huge. So stay with me. Jews think cyclically. Now, it doesn't mean that they are circular reasoning. It means that the way that they reason moves in circles, because that's the way they think. In a speech, their main point may be D, but they will talk about A, and then they'll talk about B, and they'll talk about C, and then they'll hit D. And you'll see this on the screen. And then what you'll see is you'll see D, and the little dash up at the top says D prime. That's how you would call it. It's a way of restating the point D again. And then you'll see C prime, which restates the C from earlier, and B prime, which restates the B point from earlier, and then A prime, which restates the A. The very first point they started off with is where they end. And what they have done is they have actually moved in a complete circle. But the main point of their argument is not what starts and ends the lecture, or not what starts and ends the book. It's in the middle. It's another way of looking at it is it's the tip of the arrow. The D is their main point. They think cyclically. It's the reason why Matthew in his gospel can look at Jesus and he can see Moses. Because in some sense, Jesus is making a full circle of the story of Israel, of the story of Moses. They are not thinking A equals B equals C equals D, and that's my point. They get to D and they say, and now we need to wind it back to the beginning. The book of Revelation, then, is actually a book that is written cyclically. Or, here comes the $25 word, it is written utilizing recapitulation. Recapitulation. Let me give you a fat definition, and then like apocalyptic literature a couple weeks ago, I'll give the definition, and then we'll break it down. Recapitulation is the retelling of same events from a different perspective with a different purpose, commonly involving intensification. So let's break it down. Recapitulation is retelling the same events. You have told the events one way, and now you are recapitulating them. You are retelling the same events. But this time you're retelling it from a different perspective. You are tracing the same events, but let's say now it's through the eyes of a different character, or now it's through the eyes of a different template. But it is the same events, just from a different perspective. And you do it because you have a different purpose. You're going to retell the same events with a different purpose, commonly involving intensification. As a matter of fact, if you notice from that big word recapitulation, you know from the first 5 letters of the word what it kind of is doing. Think about this in the news. In the news, in the middle of the news, if you miss, let's say, the first opening 2 or 3 stories, in the middle they will give a recap. Or like on a sports channel, they'll give a bunch of highlights and then they'll give a recap. A recap, that's just a shortened version of the word recapitulation. A recap tells the exact same events, this time from a different perspective. Usually it's all cut up, shorter, with a different purpose, to briefly summarize or catch you up on what has happened. Recap, or a recapitulation, where you tell the same events, oftentimes involving intensification, but from a different perspective with a different purpose. Is everybody with me so far? I know, we will get there together, so just hang with me. The question becomes, can we see recapitulation in other New Testament or in other books of the Bible? And the answer is absolutely. Jews think cyclically. They think in recapitulation. It's their natural way of functioning, of processing life, of writing. Let me give you an example. Genesis chapter 1 is recapitulated in Genesis chapter 2. Genesis chapter 1, you have the 7 days of creation. In Genesis chapter 2, you actually go back through the first 5 days of creation in about 2 verses. And then the rest of the 6th day is talking about the creation of man. And then as Adam has all of the animals come to him, he begins to give them their names, but he does not find a helper that is suitable for him. And so God has him go to sleep. He then pulls out one of his ribs, and from his rib he creates Eve. It's actually just a recapitulation of the creation account in Genesis chapter 1. But in chapter 2, it's retold from a different perspective with a different emphasis. Specifically, the creation and the plight of man. We see it again in Genesis chapter 41, where Pharaoh has 2 sets of dreams. And Joseph comes to him and says, actually, both dreams are saying the same thing. We're going to go through 7 years of famine. We have 7 years of plunder, 7 years of famine. We better get ready. Or Daniel chapter 2 and Daniel chapter 7. Daniel chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar sees this huge statue, and it's made of 4 different type of metals, and Daniel tells him, hey, that is 4 different kingdoms. Then in Daniel chapter 7, he sees 4 beasts coming from the sea, and he's told by an angel that it stands for 4 kingdoms. Are you seeing what I'm trying to point out? Recapitulation. Jews do this all the time. Even the Gospels themselves. The Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, a lot of times they tell the same events, but from a different perspective, with a different purpose, because every one of the Gospels were written to a specific audience to address a specific situation, and they emphasize usually a specific aspect of Jesus. Recapitulation is a normal thing in the life of the Jews because it's the way that they think. They do not think A equals B equals C equals D. They think in circles. And finding these circles are a way of showing the complete revelation of God. That's why when it comes to the book of Revelation, we should not outline it like conventional note-taking. You know, Roman numeral 1, capital A. If you try that, you will go insane because the book doesn't move linearly. It moves cyclically. And that's why I think we should look at the structure of Revelation with a picture. You'll see it on the screen. It is a picture of a spiral going back and forth until it's coming to a small point. But the spiral moves constantly back and forth over the same events, back and forth in order to make different points all coalescing into one big point. Now, right now, what I've done so far is I'm giving the big picture. Now what I want us to do is I want us to step into the text to see where this cyclical type structure starts to play out. So we've actually looked at part of this. Remember, the very first lecture, we talked about the way in which the book of Revelation comes to the end of the world over and over and over again. Now, at the time I was showing you that at the very first lecture, you didn't know the big fancy word, but now you do. Whenever you talk about the end of the world multiple times in Revelation, you realize he's recapitulating the same event. Chapter 6, verses 12 through 17, we see that the sixth seal is being broken open. And we talked about how you have stars falling from the sky, that you have the mountains and the islands being removed, that you even have the evil people on the earth crying out, "Fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the Lamb of God, for the great day of God's wrath has come." Judgment Day. It's the end of everything. What's crazy is if you move just 5 chapters later, at the 7th trumpet, the book of Revelation comes to the end of the world again, for at least a second time. So in chapter 11, verses 15 and following, you see that the Bible says, well, specifically verse 18, "The nations were angry, and your wrath has come. The time has come for judging the dead, and for rewarding your servants, the prophets, and your people who revere your name, both small and great, and for destroying those who destroy the earth." Once again, the book of Revelation comes to the end of the world. And we talked about in the first lecture how that this starts to present a problem for people that are trying to make the book of Revelation linearly, or a chronological roadmap of the future. Because how is it that you develop a roadmap when the book of Revelation has ended the world twice? From a linear progression, this becomes very troublesome. From a recapitulation perspective, this is expected because Jews think cyclically. So it shouldn't surprise us then that the end of the world happens again in chapter 14, or that it happens again in chapter 16 with the bowls, or that it happens again in chapter 19 with the rider on the white horse, or in chapter 20 or in chapter 21. Over and over and over, the book of Revelation is recapitulating the events that end the world. It tells the same events from a different perspective, and each time it says it, it's with a different purpose. A different purpose. A recap with a different purpose. Also in the book of Revelation, you see that the structure is dominated by 3 sets of 7. The majority of the material in the book of Revelation is the heartbeat, or I would say like kind of the center of the sandwich, is 3 sets of 7. You have the 7 seals, you have the 7 trumpets, and the 7 bowls. Each of them are a set of 7, and each of them end with the end of the world. They come to their completion when the world is destroyed. And what's also interesting about these 3 sets of 7 is that they all have an interlude between the 6th and the 7th element. So in between, you have the chapter 6 through chapter 8. You have the seals. What's interesting is chapter 6 actually has the very ending of chapter 6. So chapter 6 verses 12 through 17 is the 6th seal. And then there's this elongated interlude. The whole chapter 7 is looking at the 144,000 and the great multitude, who we will talk about more next week. But then you have this interlude, and then the 7th seal is picked back up in chapter 8. Chapter 8 verses 1 through 5. Then in chapter 8 verse 6, you see the 7 trumpets launch out. In chapters 8 verse 6 all the way through the end of chapter 9 verse 21, you have 6 trumpets that are blasted. And then chapters 10 all the way to chapter 11 verse 14 is an interlude. And in verse 15 you have the 7th trumpet, and then it ends through verse 19. And then the same thing happens in chapter 16, where you have the 6 bowls poured out. And then chapter 16 verse 15, it's a very small interlude. We have Jesus speak between the 6th and the 7th bowl. These 3 not only build the whole structure in this recapitulation, this cyclical letter, the cyclical events in the structure of Revelation, but they also have significant parallels amongst each other. Because every one of the sets of 7 is retelling the same events from a different perspective with a different purpose. Now, I'm going to give you each of their purposes right now, but we will actually explore them in the next lecture. The purpose of the seals is to communicate spiritual security. The purpose of the trumpets is to communicate the need for witness. The purpose of the bowls is to communicate the conduct that comes with that witness. Every one of these 3 sets of 7 goes over the same events to the end of the world, but from a different perspective: seals, trumpets, and bowls with a different purpose: spiritual security, witness, and conduct. So the structure of Revelation, you cannot think of it linearly. You must think of it cyclically. Otherwise, you're going to miss the message of the book of Revelation. Let me actually give you another side note here. Dialogue in the book of Revelation is essential. Every time something is spoken, every time something is sung, or every time you have quotation marks that someone is speaking, you need to stop and listen very clearly, because a lot of times that is the key point of what is trying to be communicated with the images. So for example, you have the 4 living creatures in Revelation chapter 4. And in verses 7 through 9, it talks about how they're surrounding the throne, and it even describes each of the 4 living creatures and how unique they are and yet how similar they are. But then right in the middle of all this description, they cry out, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and who is to come." And if you have ears to hear and you have eyes to see, you'd realize that this dialogue is actually giving you the very heartbeat of all of the images in Revelation 4. That John is pulled up to heaven in Revelation chapter 4 verse 1. He walks through the door and he sees the one on the throne, but all of the images are not made to enamor, they are made to reveal. They are made to reveal who God is. That He is the Holy One, the separate one, the sanctified one, because He is the Almighty, all-powerful one, who is eternal, the one who was and is to come. When somebody speaks, you need to stop and realize that what is being said is actually probably the very heart of the images themselves. As a matter of fact, there are 2 very strange moments in the book of Revelation. And they both happen at the end of the book, which is even more peculiar to me. Chapter 19, verse 10, and in chapter 22, verses 8 through 9, 2 separate times, John is seeing a vision, and he becomes so overwhelmed that he starts to worship the angel that's showing him the vision. Would you think after 19 chapters that he would have it clear that God is the one that you worship? But it's almost like he's so overwhelmed, he's like, I just got to worship the closest thing to him, and he bows down at an angel. Both times the angel speaks, and it ends with these powerful words that I think is spoken to John, but is also being spoken to the 7 churches of Asia Minor. For the angel cries out, "Worship God. Worship God." That if there is one message in the book of Revelation that can summarize the whole thing, it is that you need to worship God, because in Revelation, worship is war. Who you worship determines who you become. Who you worship determines how you act. Who you worship even determines where you end at the end of your life. In the book of Revelation, this very war, this very conflict is centered on worship. Whenever you see an interlude or whenever you see dialogue, an interjection, somebody speaks, you need to understand that that is put there intentionally as an indicator that this is what the imagery is talking about. Okay, done with the side note. You don't have to pay extra for that. Let's jump back into the structure. What's interesting about the structure too is that you don't just have these 3 sets of 7. As a matter of fact, you have an interlude in between the 3 sets of 7. So in chapters 6 through 8, you have the seals. Immediately it's followed by the trumpets in chapters 8 through 11. Knowing that there is another set of 7, the bowls, you would expect the bowls to begin in chapter 12. But they don't. Instead, the bowls aren't even introduced for 3 chapters. They begin to be introduced in chapter 15 and are poured out in chapter 16. In chapters 12, 13, and 14, you have at this climactic point in the letter 3 chapters. You could summarize the 3 chapters as past, present, and future, because they all 3 do follow that kind of linear progression in a cyclical structure. Is your mind blowing up yet? You'll be fine, I promise. Just hang with me. The payoff's coming. Chapters 12, 13, and 14, though, they interject. They are an interlude in these 3 cycles of 7 to introduce the 3 antagonists, the 3 enemies of God. Chapter 12 is a fascinating text. As a matter of fact, chapter 12, if you have eyes to see and ears to hear, you'd realize chapter 12 is a familiar story, but told in a very unfamiliar way. Well, let's just begin reading. Chapter 12, verse 1. A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head, saturated in symbols, yes? She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. So at the beginning of chapter 12, we have a woman that is pregnant, and she is crying out. Now what's interesting, it is who this woman gives birth to actually identifies who the woman is, at least on some level. Go down to verse 5 of chapter 12, and it tells us who she gives birth to. Verse 5 says, she gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter. Who's the baby? I mean, come on. Who's the baby? Yeah, it's Jesus. How do we know? We know because Psalm chapter 2, which is a messianic psalm, has just been quoted. The baby is the one who will rule the nations with an iron scepter. And if you know it's a messianic text, then as a Christian, you know the Messiah is Jesus. The woman's just give birth to Jesus. So who is the woman? On some level, the woman is Mary. In some amazing way, that we're back in Bethlehem. Except for what's interesting is that this isn't a silent night. I mean, the woman's screaming in verse 2. As a matter of fact, when you start to pull the veil back on this event, you realize nothing about what you knew of Bethlehem is occurring here. Because verse 3, something very strange begins to happen. Then another sign appeared in heaven. An enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on its heads. Its tail swept 1/3 of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth so that it might devour her child the moment it was born. Have you ever been to a nativity program where that was happening? I mean, it's kind of a strange thing, like, hey, my kid's the donkey in the nativity program. Oh yeah, well my kid's, baby Jesus. Well, my kid's the dragon waiting to eat the baby. As a Revelation scholar, as a person where Revelation's kind of my go-to thing, I kind of feel bad for my kids a bit because they get into awkward situations. My son Zion came home one day from school and he was like, hey Dad, he's like, is there a dragon at the birth of Jesus? I was like, well, yeah, buddy. He's like, yeah, there is. Revelation 12. He's like, I was telling my friends on the playground, but nobody would believe me. And I was like, well, just know that you're more theologically accurate than they are. That's all I could really tell them. And it also is probably confusing because in honor of my mentor, Dr. Robert Lowry, every Christmas in our nativity scene, in the very back, behind the shepherds and behind the wise men, whether or not you think that's historically accurate, and behind Mary and behind Joseph and behind baby Jesus, in the background, we have a red dragon. Every year. From this text. Because in this text, we are in the manger scene. Mary is giving birth to the one who will rule the worlds with an iron scepter. But what this does is it pulls back the veil and it says, you need to make sure that on that silent night that you don't forget that there is a war that is raging, that there is a dragon that is lurking, that there is an enemy waiting to devour even the Christ child itself. In chapter 12, we are introduced to someone who has been in the background for the first 11 chapters, but now becomes a key piece of the foreground. Now becomes somebody that is a key central figure, a key central enemy, the dragon, who in verse 9 is defined as the ancient serpent, the devil, Satan, the one who leads the whole world astray. In chapter 13, we get 2 more enemies that now come on the scene. At the beginning of chapter 13, the dragon stands on the shore of the sea and he calls forth a beast. And out of the sea, this beast emerges, and it looks a lot like all of the beasts that Daniel saw in chapter 7. All of them mushed together into one ferocious and vicious beast. And this beast is given power and the throne and authority by the dragon in verse 2. In chapter 13, verse 4, the beast is even worshipped alongside of the dragon. In verse 5, this beast utters proud words, he gives blasphemies, and he exercises great authority. And then we have, in verse 11, a second beast. This time he doesn't come from the sea, he comes from the earth. And this beast, though, is just as much a part of the dragon's plan as the first one. This beast comes out, and in verse 11, he speaks like a dragon. As a matter of fact, he's very shrewd, because it says he looks like a lamb, but he speaks like a dragon. Catch that hint there. Wolves in sheep's clothing. He speaks like a dragon. In verse 14, this beast is given the miraculous powers to deceive the inhabitants of the earth to reach the goal of verse 15. For all of the creation to worship the first beast from the sea and the dragon. If you look really closely, what you see in chapters 12 and 13 is the revelation of an unholy trinity. A revelation of an unholy trinity, an evil triad. Matter of fact, if you look at the beast from the sea, you'll even see that he mimics or he parodies or he gives a lesser version of the ministry of the Son, of Jesus. For whenever you look in Revelation chapter 13, verse 3, this beast is said to have a wound to his head that is a fatal wound, and yet he comes back to life. You hear the resurrection. What's interesting too is that the beast from the earth seems to have a parody ministry to the Holy Spirit. For the job of the beast from the earth is a ministry of communication, is a ministry of miraculous power, is a ministry that is geared towards the worship, connecting the inhabitants of the earth to worship the first 2/3 of the Trinity. What you have in chapters 12 and 13 is the introduction of the key enemy, the true conflict that the Christians of Asia Minor are struggling with. It's an unholy Trinity that is completely mirroring and fighting against the true Trinity. Then in chapter 14, something else is introduced. Something else that once again has been in the background of a lot of the imagery in the first 13 chapters, but is very much in the foreground for the Christians in Asia Minor. In chapter 14, verse 8, you have an angel that cries out, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great." This is the first time in the book of Revelation that Babylon has been mentioned. And it's being mentioned after the unholy Trinity because it's saying something about its relationship to it. In the book of Revelation, Babylon is the manifestation of the unholy Trinity's ministry on earth. Babylon is the people, is the city, is the conduit through which the unholy Trinity does its work. Can you hear the parody there as well? Babylon is always put as a contrasting image to the church. For in the book of Revelation, we have Babylon, the evil people that belong to the dragon and the two beasts. But we also have the New Jerusalem, the people that belong to God the Father and God the Son and God the Spirit, and that are being called to do the ministry of the Holy Trinity on earth. You also see Babylon depicted as a prostitute in Revelation 17, which is in direct contrast to the bride of Christ, to the beautiful bride of Christ in Revelation 19, who's wearing fine linen, which stands for the righteous acts of the saints. In Revelation chapters 12, 13, and 14, we have this interjection into 3 sets of 7 that introduces the 4 key enemies of God: the unholy Trinity, the dragon and the two beasts, and Babylon. Now here's what's interesting. Remember, we're thinking cyclically. In the book of Revelation, these 4 enemies will be destroyed in reverse order. Remember I told you, a Jew thinks, if his main point is D, he thinks A, B, C, D, D prime, C prime, B prime, A prime. Remember. Well, what we have is the introduction of the dragon, A, point A, in chapter 12. Introduction of the two beasts, B, which is in the cyclical movement. Then we have the key point. In chapter 14, point C is the introduction of Babylon. Babylon then is destroyed in chapters 17 and 18, which would be your C prime. In chapter 19, you see the destruction of the two beasts. And in chapter 20, which would be your A prime, you see the destruction of the dragon. Why is this important? Because remember, this is fancy word is chiasm, in a cyclical thinking, the key point is the tip of the arrow. The people of Revelation are wrestling with, how do we engage Babylon? How is it that we can overcome Babylon? They seem like they're in control. They seem like they're winning. And Revelation says, I want you first of all to know they are part of an unholy trinity. And that whenever they come on the scene, it is through the power of this dragon and his two beasts. And when they come on the scene, they are carrying out His will. Your God has not abandoned you. Your God is still in control, and He will move. And when He does, Babylon's the first to go. As a matter of fact, He takes 2 chapters to describe the destruction of Babylon, Rome, whereas He disposes of Satan in 4 verses in Revelation 27 through 10. That does not mean that Satan is not important. It means what you think is the most important is actually a part of a cosmic battle that is raging, that will go throughout all of time till the end of the world. Notice why this comes in the middle of the cycles of 7. This unholy trinity and this manifestation of their will on earth through the city like Babylon is what is completely at odds with God the Father, God the Son, and God the Spirit and their holy church. The book of Revelation's structure is giving us a context through which we can engage the conflict that is raging. So, to kind of summarize, to kind of give a recap of this whole crazy concept of cyclical thinking versus linear thinking, recapitulation, let me just point out a couple of problems with chronological progression of linear thinking in Revelation. The first lecture, we looked at the end of the world. He comes to the end of the world at least 7 times by my count. That number's probably not an accident if you remember the symbol lecture. You also have in chapter 10 the 7 thunders. Isn't that weird? In chapter 10, verses 3 through 4, this mighty angel begins to speak. It says when he speaks, 7 thunders rang out. And John was about to write the 7 thunders. Whenever the voice says, do not write what the 7 thunders have said, seal it up. Now, if you're thinking linearly, that's a pretty big problem. Because if point A has to move to point B, has to move to point C, what happens if you're not allowed to talk about point B? What happens if you don't know it? Well, then how in the world are you supposed to move from point A to point C? But it is interesting knowing that our cycles of 7 would move to 4. Remember what the number 4 stands for? A number of completion, usually attached to the earth. Cyclical thinking. Christ's birth happens in chapter 12. If we're thinking linear, this is a roadmap, it's kind of weird that Jesus is born halfway through the book. Does that mean the world has ended twice before Jesus is even born? No. I mean, it does if you're thinking linearly, but recapitulation-wise, you're not bound by time. You're able to communicate your point, regardless of where it takes you on the spectrum of history. Chapter 16, Jesus reiterates, I'm coming like a thief. If we're thinking linearly, we could say, but Jesus, I know where we're at. We're in the 6th bowl. You don't come like a thief. I can predict it at this point. No, Jesus says, I'm not moving linearly. So even at the end of the book, you'd still be just as confused in your prediction. The battle, or the no battle motif, is also a difficult thing to... Matter of fact, the Battle of Armageddon is interesting. Because in chapter 16, they gather for the Battle of Armageddon, but guess what? There is no battle. It happens 3 times in Revelation. Chapter 16, they gather for battle. No battle, just an annihilation. Chapter 19, they gather for battle. No battle, just an annihilation. Chapter 20, they gather for a battle. No battle, there's an annihilation. Why? The battle's already been won. The battle is over. The Son of God has already been crucified, and that is where the victory is. We're just waiting for the parade, friends. All of these elements start to come together to point towards this one reality. The book of Revelation cannot be read linearly. It must be read cyclically, like a Jew thinks. It must be read through the eyes of John on Patmos, writing a letter to the churches of Asia Minor, so that as we move in these cycles of 7, we will be able to understand the key enemy that is causing Babylon to destroy many people around us, and to allow us to stand firm even in the face of conflict. All right, I think that's enough for this week. We will next week talk about application. How do we apply this to the book of Revelation to our lives? Until then, I love you. Have a good week.